Bible study and conversation this morning. If you would, you can go ahead and get your Bibles open. We're going to be predominantly in the text of Judges this morning. We do have a few things that are finishing out the closing parts of Joshua, but the bulk of our time will be spent in thinking about and considering the history and geography of the time frame relative to the Judges. Before we get any further, though, and start talking about our class and details going forward, if you would, please bow with me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that are found in Jesus. We thank you for the time we share in study. We certainly thank you for the encouragement that comes from your word and the greater understanding of God and his goodness that we can glean from the scriptures. Help us to become mindful in our behavior, obedient in our actions, and thankful for our relationship to you. We offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so a couple of, administrative things. We do have some who have been joining our classes recently, both in person and online, and I'll make this broad statement. If you would like to get access to not only the books that we're using, we have those available for you that I can send as an email to you. You can have attachment to your document there, or I can show you where you can get them. If you're having trouble getting them that way, please let me know. I can make sure that we can help you get them either through the digital version or a printed version. In addition to that, usually a couple of days before class, sometimes as early as Wednesday morning or Thursday morning, I'm sending out an email that summarizes the content of the area we're looking at. It's a shorter version with a couple extra details that is basically what's also found in the workbook, often attaching the maps that we're using so that it's a little more compact, and that's available as well. So if you would like that, you need to give me your email address for the digital versions, or just talk to me after class, and we can certainly make that available for you. And if you're watching online, you got to send us a message that way too, and we can make that happen. Right now, though, as mentioned, we're kind of in that little middle space between the closing parts of Judges and the opening refrains of the downward spiral, or sometimes thought of as a repeating cycle of Judges. And there's a couple of things that we'll talk about with that in a second. But let's pause for a moment and think through both the history side and the structural geography side of the apportioning of Israel's promised land. And again, we're thinking about this in terms of how do these things then stage our understanding of God's people. So let's roll the clock back just a little bit further to two other events. Event number 2 in our list of 2 other events is detailed for us by Moses in regards to how this land is going to be laid out, how they're going to get what they're going to get. And in that laying out of things, there's a couple of things that are mentioned in advance that are important. Is every tribe going to be in possession of physical land? No, it's not the case. There's a tribe that is set aside that's not going to be getting a land per se part of the promise. But are they going to be benefiting from the land? Yeah, they're going to receive an equal portion of God's blessing in that regard. Which tribe, by the way, is the ones that are excluded from that land contract?
Levi.
It's Levi. That also then leads to our related second point to that, not our first historical event. We'll go back further to that in a second. And that's going to be some of the sanctuary cities, as we sometimes refer to them, or specific cities within Israel. These are also going to be, in part of this geographical siloing of the land. How many special cities like that are created in the context of Israel? You guys remember? There's 2 ways you can answer this. You can answer with a specific number or a relative number. If you're sneaky like me, and sometimes I am, the answer is less than 10. I know there's less than 10. And I'll add this little caveat to that. And if my brain isn't working, there's 6 special cities like this situated throughout Israel, pairs of them going from north to south. What role do they serve, by the way? What's the special cities' role in both the spiritual placement of Israel and, we would say, their civil and criminal justice system, if we're going to try to make it 21st century, 22nd century context? Who lived mostly in those cities? Do you remember? Or who was centered in those cities? Levites are centered in those cities to serve a role that's both spiritual and civil. Because what would you do if things got bad for you in a criminal/civil matter? Where would you run to? One of those cities, yeah, right. I'm going to go there. And then the ruling parties, both the Levites and some of the city elders, would then help make sure that this was an impartial experience so that the law would be carefully followed. Keep in mind that when we read the law as laid out in our biblical text, it's really hard for us to not superimpose on top of it our mindfulness of current laws. We tend to read the Bible through the lens of our own experiences. And so when you look at a current, like our legal system, we tend to think about, okay, which of these things are civil and which of these things are God's spiritual law? They're not presented that way to us. They are presented like this. So we need to be a careful and considerate reader to realize that in all of those things, there is the letter of the law, and then in the broader sense, there's what God's trying to accomplish. Often that civil law, that criminal law, that spiritual law, we're all achieving the same purpose from different corners. Where we don't do that with our laws. We keep, by the nature of our governing system, criminal and civil over here. And then we say, well, all the spiritual stuff is over there. And we pretend like the two overlap. But that's kind of silly, right? And there's no way that your moral compass cannot impact the way that you read civil and criminal law. It always affects you emotionally, practically, and eventually it will also roll back and affect you spiritually. And that's important when we're going forward in the text of Judges, by the way. That principle is going to reassert itself when we read about the mess of the text of Judges. But let's take one more step back and think to the structure of the promises that were made to Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham, and Moses. What were some of the concepts or the specific promises, you can pick and choose how you want to answer that question, that were pledged to the descendants of Adam? What was going to happen to that family? What's God promise from Adam's side of things? There are going to be some blessings coming back through your seed, right? Through your seed, through the seed of Adam, through the seed of Eve. The serpent's head is going to be crushed. And this whole cycle then narrows from Noah to Abram. And now we have a series of maybe 3 prominent promises. Seed, land, what else? There's an overarching redemptive arc to this too, okay? So that's all beginning to play out because now their numbers have grown by whatever accounting you want to use to a substantial nation. Enough to make the other nations, all of them, nervous about their size. Egypt, nervous about their size. Moab, Ammon, all of the smaller tribes inside of the promised land, Canaan, Palestine, Israel area, all nervous about their size. So that promise is continually fulfilled. Now, their land promise is being fulfilled, right? As the various cities are being accounted for, both the northern part on their initial occupation and as they move their way southward, in thinking through all of those cycles and events. So they are gradually capturing those lower cities that include cities like Lachish, probably one of the best documented late cities of Israel, but it's conquered in this early conquest area. Lachish, I think, actually is the last holdout of the final occupations of Israel's territorial possessions before the fall of Jerusalem itself. It's one of the stronghold cities that was initially captured in the conquest, and then it was fortified by David, by Solomon, and then also through the work of the kings that we'll see later. All right, so that brings us to centering in on Judges. Ask you a question this way. Who is your favorite judge and why? Because this is let me add a side question to that. How many times in your reading of the Bible have you seen judges like the judges of the text of here presented as superheroes? Or in VBSs, they're presented as like champions. Or even in other media, they're presented in very positive lights. How many times have you guys seen that? Is that pretty common? If you slowly and carefully read Judges, how do they come across to you? Are judges wonderful people, making perfect choices every time? No. In fact, they are probably at times the worst, right? Not all of them, but as a group, there's not a lot of like really great role models for the totality of their person. That doesn't mean they're not at times faithful. It does not mean they're not functional or useful in the story of God's people or even seeking God. It just means that maybe our perception of who they are is over here. Whatever it is God wants them to be known for is over here. And the Bible text is trying to pull us there. It's trying to push us this way. So again, what's your favorite judge from the text of Judges? And then know this, you're going to have to justify it with the answer to the question, why? Why are they your favorite?
I like Samuel.
Samuel, there you go, sneaky answer, because Samuel's one of our last judges, right? And he appears at the end of the text of Judges. And we forget that the judges overlap into the following stories, right? All right, so we can't use Samuel. He's off the table now.
I like him because he seems to be a just man doing what the Lord wanted.
Yeah. Probably of the ones who are identified in this role as a judge, clearly the best of them. And I think Eli also is indicated as a judge, too, for much the same reason we probably put him there. So let's narrow ourselves down into the text of Judges. Anyone have a favorite there? It's tough, right? Everyone's nervous. I want you to think about this. This section here, this historical text here in Joshua and Judges in the early part, it's referring to about a 300-year period. And here's one way in which we can lay them out. I've got a second one here as well that will show them all for us. This is a way to think about what's going on here. We tend to read things in a linear way, that is, top to bottom. So we've got our judges as recorded in the text of Judges, major judges from Othniel all the way down to Samson. There's some minor judges that don't get a lot of detail that are included as well. And then Eli and Samuel are also known as judges, but they're not in the text of Judges. But there's another thing going on in the text that's important. And though this is a history and geography class, it helps us understand how history and geography and God's storytelling overlap. So this image up here, the judge's death spiral, is one of the ways in which it's referred to. It's something that Jared Saltz and I put together with Maria McRae a couple years ago. And it represents the way in which we can think about these stories. You'll notice, just quickly, and we'll see this a couple times today and maybe next Sunday, that the stories have a sense of interconnectedness in that the things that happen in the prologue invert and repeat in the epilogue of the text. The things that happen in the life of Samson very closely mimic the life of Othniel, and so on. So the colors actually help us understand how these things interact with each other and how they are trying to teach us something. This is all taking place while the course of Israel is itself flipping. So Joshua closes out the text of, or God through Moses closes out the recording of these events, and whomever is writing for us the text of Joshua with Joshua's great speech. In his speech, he kind of echoes what Moses says a couple times in the text of Deuteronomy and says, in essence, if you follow God, you will be blessed. But if you don't keep the covenant, you'll be cursed. And there's a slight hint by Joshua's behavior that seems to indicate his question as to whether they will or not. That's something that is kind of easy for us to figure out because, like someone who's read the end of the mystery book, we know exactly what happens to the people of Israel at that point, right? For the most part, does Israel go to higher levels of faithfulness, or as indicated in our little death funnel here, do they go downward? They immediately, almost it seems, just flush themselves into an absolute mess. Another way to illustrate Israel after the death of Joshua is to imagine a giant dumpster that's on fire and going down the river. Because that's precisely how Israel seems to behave. They go from Israel fighting against the nations outside to God bringing judges to judge Israel from the outside back to them, to Israel fighting Israel at the end of the text in ways that are increasingly awful. Some of them are even repeated kinds of instruments and events that were so egregious and so awful that God judged his people by bringing divine beings into play or divine power. Some of the things, and this is the quickest illustration of this. What is Sodom and Gomorrah known for? 3 things, right? What's the first thing Sodom and Gomorrah is known for? What's that? They are a representation of abject sin. The second thing is the kind of sin. And there's actually 2 things that are indicated. There is a tone of they did not care for strangers at all. Not pure hospitality, but protection as well. They simply didn't care for others, to an extent that they were willing to even just toss even their own kind to the wolves at times. Thirdly, or secondly in that same thing, the kind of sin is specifically noted a couple times. So egregious as to be equivalent, by the way, to how it's discussed prior to the flood. That Sodom and Gomorrah becomes a replication, if you will, of man without morals, man without compass. And then the type of judgment that God called down his power upon them to such great severity that it was wiped smooth. Again, very similar to some of the wording and context of Noah. So all of that then, by the way, repeats itself in some of the aspects of the text of Judges. But instead of it being the others doing it, it's Israel doing it to Israel. And so that's important for us when we begin to think about, okay, what's going on underneath this? Because this is both history, geography, and now it's what's God's telling us side too. Because this interaction here also sets the stage for idolatry, severe idolatry. Even at times where individuals make such kind of promises and pledges that they're willing to sacrifice their own children to keep their oaths. That's the middle space of the text. So we start thinking about what's happened to the Israel that was supposed to be separate, but now is behaving just like the Canaanites. They're not any different. So they go in under the leadership of Joshua, but for some series of reasons, in absence of them having this earthly leader corralling their behavior, they end up just becoming like the nations around them. So historically, what had happened that allowed that to occur? How good were they at cleansing the land?
Not as good as they were supposed to be.
So they left some of the peoples there, not solely the tribe that tricked them, the group that tricked them, left others there as well. There were some strongholds that they left in place. And it seems that then created the seeds for the change. Because remember, we talked about this a couple times. How did the Canaanites, the Moabites, those of the kingdom of Og, how did they engage in treaties and normalizing relations with the nations around them? What was their standard method?
Married into the king's family.
Yeah, and not just the king's families at times. The whole groups would intermarry. Now keep in mind that these are not those who are visually often different from one another, from the same genetic groups. So they often physically look the same, but you could tell when someone's from somewhere else. And they knew that by their culture, by their faith, by their dress. The Israelites most certainly looked strange as they were in the same clothes for the last 40 years. But they were going to say, we're going to marry in together. We're going to become one. We'll be one family. And was that happening here? It most definitely was. What's interesting is the one bright spot from this era also tells that same story of intermarrying with the nations around them. When we think about Boaz and Ruth, what's Ruth's heritage?
Moabite.
She's a Moabite. And so she's from the very groups that offer to intermarry. But she converts. Her faith changes in this relationship. And so she becomes part of the stream of seekers, if you will, that are moving in to see and to know God. If Israel had kept the commitment to cleanse the land, the story could have been different. Now note that I say could have been different, not would have been different, because I don't know. It certainly would have changed some things. There's an important principle that we're going to try to consistently apply when we're thinking about the history of these events. I'm going to reframe a biblical truth. It's still true, but it's in context of our history that all things are possible, right? If there's something can happen, it's possible. But just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's plausible, that it's a sensible outcome, even though it's actually possible. If I were to flip a coin, is it possible that it could land on this desk, spinning, in its spherical sense, and then hold on its edge and just sit up there? Is that possible? I think it's possible. I think maybe a physicist would come back and say, no, it's absolutely impossible. But I think it's possible. But is it plausible? So that's what we're talking about here when we're thinking about what could have, might have happened. Yeah, it's possible, but there's some plausible things that would come into play here. That is, there's still the nations around them. There's still the hearts of men. And it's not the core part of the story that takes place either way. But we can learn, hey, doing what God asks us to do is always going to produce a better outcome. Or at least the potential for a better outcome. And by the way, if you want to read a text that's really helpful for us, read Deuteronomy chapter 7. It's really kind of staging how things should be rather than how they are for the people of Israel in this case. And gradually you see this interconnectedness expand in significance to the point where we are now thinking about what's going on with these tribes as they are interacting with places around them. The first consequence of this meshing together with Israel trying to keep the land and their hearts pure and the Canaanites around them is the presentation of the oppression that comes from Mesopotamia. Othniel is the first one reported for us, but we're not really told a whole lot of details of what's going on. Judges doesn't seem to focus in on the same level of minutia that will appear in Samuel and Kings, and then later in the reformatting of that same sense of history in Chronicles. And that's because, in part, this is not necessarily written out to us in A to Z format. Something we need to kind of keep in mind is to realize that Judges probably isn't following a chronological layout. That is, what happens at the first part of the book isn't necessarily the first things that happen, and what happens at the end of the book isn't necessarily the last things that happens per se, and the stuff in the middle may not be in order. Because, remember, it's told in that structure that has the stories reacting with each other. That's part of the writing methodology of Judges. And so also in the way that this is told, you can kind of see that these events overlap at times. The participants show that. But the Moabites, the Amalekites, then start becoming the next space there, and the Ammonites. They are going to oppress Israel for a period of 18 years. They would take the city of Jericho, that crucial trade route city. There's two major trade routes that go through Jericho, by the way. Which are those two? Remember, it's on the other side of the Jordan, so it can't be our way of Kings or the King's Highway. Way of the sea and the way of Shur. And they actually kind of fork up through Israel, and they converge there in Jericho. From a sense of economic geography and where the buckies are placed, it makes perfect sense, because it's the right middle distance between one spot and the next, and it converges right there. So they can resupply, they would place they can grow dates there, they can get food, but then it becomes also worth capturing. And if you remember, Jericho itself has somewhere around 25 to 45 historical records of being captured, where they've crushed everything and built a new thing on top of it. And so it's pretty common. In this setting here, this is where Ehud killed Eglon, king of Moab, and rallied the Israelites. And it's one of those stories from the text of Judges, which is intermediate in its kind of storytelling side, in that it's not presented to us purely as a spiritual thing. It is very base and very physical. And even the way it's told to us is pretty gruesome, right? How does Eglon die? Stabbed in the stomach. And where does Eglon die? His own house, in his indoor outhouse is the way to think about the way that they're built. And so there's no plumbing per se in this context, but he is in the place where he would relieve himself. Here's something to also note. Our translations of the Bible, they often take the smelly parts, the sharp parts, and the uncomfortable parts, and they smooth them over. There's lots of reasons why that happened. They're all bad. But then the telling of the death of Eglon by Ehud, if read without our smoothing over, it would probably make most of our stomachs kind of roil a little bit and rock and roll, because it's not pleasant. It's a fairly rough death. And Ehud himself is described as someone who is, in essence, trained to kill. We tend to think of him as a left-handed person, but the way in which that word is used is that he has trained his left hand for war so well that it has become better than his natural hand. He's most decidedly not a naturally right-handed person. There's other words for that. But he's trained to kill so efficiently that he has made himself better with his offhand than he is with his strong hand. And by the way, it's not an uncommon thing, because from the region where he's from, we'll later see in another group of Israelites who are also so skilled with their left hand that becomes their nickname. And we do that today in the military forces today. We give everybody nicknames. You got the Skull Squadron, the Screaming Eagles, you got all that kind of stuff. And so there's nothing new to do that, to have a name that way. It was earned. It was earned by their willingness to train and be aggressive. Ehud then is able to achieve a kind of victory that led the Israelites to a period of relative peace in this cycle of circumstances. But we'll note that gradually the Canaanites began doing what they seemed to do quite regularly and gain strength and power to control the areas that would be in the valley of Jezreel. And they would put pressure on Israel for about 20 years. Deborah comes into play, identified as someone who is not only a prophetess, but serving the role of a judge. Here's something to think about as a pause right here. In absence of the text of Judges, so pull that out of your brain for a moment, what do you think judges do?
Judge.
They judge. And how do we vision judges today? They make decisions on paper, right? They signed an order. In the text of Judges, what are the judges there doing? How many of them are judging with paper? Is there any of them that judge with paper? They would judge with paper if they could make it into a sword. They judge with their fist. They judge with their spear, their dagger, their ox goad, their piece of animal that they picked up to kill others with. They judge with other animals. They tie firebrands to two critters and send them off to the edges to judge. All of these judges, and by the way, the word judges itself is one of those smooth over words. I would suggest that a way to think of it, there's a few other terms and nuances, but these judges are more like warlords than they are like kings, as a general tone. And especially so as we begin to think that the further our story goes, from the north to the south, from Dan to Beersheba, Israel itself is less and less like God's heart wants them to be, and more like Canaan. They become just like the kings they deposed. So these warlords, these judges, these despots, these leaders of various kinds, even when we appreciate them for various things, are shredding and shedding their identity as Israelites, because they become just like Canaan. And at the end of the text, by the way, we'll note that they become so much like Canaan that even the Levites start acting like Canaanite religious leaders. Deborah lives in the scene between Ramah and Bethel, near Mount Ephraim. She sent for Barak of Kadesh to gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun to meet the Canaanites in the battle of Mount Tabor. Barak does not have enough faith to go alone. And as such, he was told that the honor would go to a woman. there's a couple of nuances this we need to pay attention to. One of them goes all the way back to the threads of the garden. This is an inversion, a way to think about it, to link it in your brain of what should be taking place. Barak should be leading. If he's been asked to go, he should go. He's not willing to go. So on the spiritual thing, it's a reminder of how it should be and a little bit of the conflict from the garden. But on an earthly thing, this should have shamed him. The culture of the Canaanites, the culture of Israel, combined together, he should have been ashamed for his lack of faith and courage, for this honor to go to another. The captain expected to find peace in his last bits, but he was killed by another. This is a point where you could insert the biblical truth that be careful if you're seeking the world's caricature of a biblical wife, because the Bible's characters of biblical wives is far more wide. And so these are women who are engaged in doing things for God's service that we would probably struggle to even fathom. And yet they are praised and honored in so doing and serving God and his plan. Something always to kind of think about and think, hey, what's going on here? This is the history. But remember, this is the bad part of Israel's history. Everyone's being influenced by the world around them. And it's not just the men being influenced, it's all of them. Across the board, there's some awfulness. In the Canaanite territory, it's overlapping with the territory of Judah. Notice, if you will, the location of Hazor, the valley of Jezreel, and Mount Tabor in these spaces. I want you to think about why it is that Barak would pull his army from those particular tribes. Think about what's going on there. You see what's going on in the settings as they're coming down and pushing in this regard. There's something to think about. Gideon would be our next judge. Or another phrase is deliverer. That kind of fits in their behavior model and the word. He stops the oppression of the Midianites and the Amalekites, because these two groups had joined forces. The Midianites that are involved here are a nomadic people, much like Israel had been, nomads themselves. They made their living by moving up and down the king's highway. In the story that we find in the text, they come up from the king's highway, cross the Jordan at the ford near the Jabbok, and stole crops from the tribes in the central portion of the land. 7 years in a row. Now they're at a point where they are having to hide their harvests in caves or in any other place. And it went southwest then from that point down to Gaza. We think about this area. We're looking at the section that is below the Sea of Galilee and moving down towards, southernly, towards the Dead Sea. And so that's our space there. Gideon would call his army from the tribes of Asher, Zebulun, Manasseh, and Naphtali. Gideon was of the tribe of Manasseh. And so in this setting, God would then eventually create a context to shift the level of dependence. So they had gone from thousands and great captains to this sorting hat behavior to get down to a group of 300. You know, the water from that tributary that they're drinking from is pretty nice. It's perennially cool and cold. It tastes really good. And if you're on a really hot day, like it was when I was there, the first thing you want to do is just jump right in it. It was hot, it was dry, and that water was good. It was probably as good, it felt as good as jumping into the Tellico River up in Tennessee. It's one of the cleanest rivers in East Tennessee is the Tellico. Feels like Disneyland up there. So imagine, if you will, the cleanest little stream you've ever seen. not an ounce of dirt or silt in it, and you've had a hot, long day. This is helping us figure out the behavior of those who are committed to a task. If you're going to war, does it make sense to flush your head into the water like it's a bucket to cool yourself off and just completely ignore your surroundings and turn into, an ostrich? They're the ones that stick their heads in the ground. My brain says that maybe they're the ones that do that. There's probably a different critter that does that. But it comes out with those who crouched and kept their attendance to their task in the midst of a very simple circumstance. Now that's our earthly view of things. The mechanism doesn't matter. God chose this one. The outcome is, with a small group of servants, God was able to accomplish great good. So in the middle of our story, we're finding a moment where God is reminding them that, hey, you do know that you should be trusting in me. Now, when they closed out the story of God's people in Joshua, they were trusting, we would believe, in God, right? But as soon as Joshua was out of the picture, do we come up with maybe they were trusting in Joshua and not in God? It's possible. Plausible, for sure. Behavior seems to match that that's the case, because they just go from there to trusting a warlord after a warlord after a warlord after another tribe after another person, and not seeking back to God. They would then make a surprise attack upon their enemy, and then that would show them fleeing down the Jordan toward the ford that is at the mouth of the river Jabbok. The men of Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh rejoined Gideon and now were pursuing the army. And men from Ephraim would stop the enemy at the fords of the Jordan. Gideon and his army caught and destroyed the enemy and took much goods from those who had been harassing Israel now at this point for a good 7-8 years. Remember, we've kind of covered at this point about 150 years of this intermediate period. We're going to find 3 more judges in the text here: Abimelech, Tola, and Jair. Abimelech is not the kind of judge that we're seeing in the sense of a deliverer. He is the wicked son of Gideon, who set himself as a king over the city of Shechem. We see him flipping further our perception of Israel. They're no longer really Israel in some senses. Physically, yes. But by spiritually senses, they're idolatry in high form. Let's pause right there, because we've got about 1 minute left of my clock time, which actually means we're really close to the end of our time for this morning. And we'll pick up here in the middle of Judges next Sunday morning. Before we close out, though, do you guys have any questions? Things that I ran over or you wanted to make a quick point about? All right, reminder, if you have questions about getting material for the class or in general, please let me know. I'm happy to provide that for you. Thanks, everybody.